The funny thing is, I hate to think of myself as a superhero specialist. I wrote a lot of them because they're what sold the best.
I love superheroes, but we have so narrowed it that the stuff that isn't superheroes is really marginalized.
I think comic book stores are a wonderful thing, except to the extent that they encourage everything to look like X-Men.
If I told you movies are made about the Old West, conspiracy theories, hard-boiled criminals, or even wizards, you wouldn't be surprised. Film is just a medium to tell stories. Comic books are exactly the same, but many people assume it's all one genre, the superhero.
Superhero is one of the few, maybe that's the only genre that really sort of does originate in comics, and comic books especially. They existed before Superman, but Superman clearly is the paradigm, it's the beginning of the whole genre. And of course they're ideal for that because anything is possible, spectacle and fantasy is completely unlimited in the comics form. And I think there's a particular American fascination with them, which the rest of the world has in different ways. I mean, there are other fantasy heroes in manga, has some samurai warriors, for example, and in France and much of Europe, bizarrely, the Western actually is still extraordinarily popular. So that's a whole genre that's vanished from American comics.
Superheroes basically hijacked the comics medium in the American comics world. Because they were so appealing and so successful, when they were launched, they sort of just expanded and expanded until by the 50s or 60s, they were what everyone saw as being what happened in comic books.
The funny thing is, I hate to think of myself as a superhero specialist. I wrote a lot of them because they're what sold the best.
I've looked at stuff over the years and said, well, you know, I would love to do a Western, for example. But we really know that, except under certain very rare, very narrow circumstances, most of which I wouldn't want to pursue, there's really no market for a Western. I'd love to do an old-fashioned romance comic, you know, what they call a girl's book. But of course, girls don't buy comics, you'll be told by the guy behind the counter in the comic shop who's going to be ordering the comics, so you know he's not going to order it.
There are stores where X-Men is their #1 seller, or something like X-Men is their #1 seller, and they don't really have the shelf space or the inclination to market much else. So they become shrines to that. They paint the outsides of their stores with things with drawings that essentially say, all we've got in here are superheroes, people. And then only people who buy superheroes go in, and the stores go, well, that's all the public wants. And they miss the opportunity that they could sell something else in there.
The police procedural is a type of crime fiction that really gets into police work. You follow the cop as they follow the criminal. Now you tell that story in Gotham City and you're dealing with a whole new kind of cop story.
Gotham Central sprung out of me and Greg Rucka being asked to write a book together. And the book that they asked us to write together, we both said we'd do just to work with each other. But then we were working on a thing called Officer Down, where Jim Gordon, Commissioner Gordon, got shot. And it was a police procedural in Gotham City. The stars of it were really the cops investigating it, and the Batman characters became sort of peripheral characters around that. While we were working on that, Greg and I were talking about this other project, and I just asked him, do you really want to do this, or are you just doing this so we can work together? And he admitted he was doing it for the same reason I was, and I said, well, let's do our cop book. We're having more fun writing these cops. Let's propose the cop book, because somehow we had talked about it, and each of us had cop stories that we wanted to tell in that environment. We thought it was an interesting way to approach Batman, is to have Batman be very rarely in the book. And I thought, you know, what does Batman feel like to the cops who walk into that crime scene after Batman's destroyed it? You know, or what does it feel like to be a cop walking through the Joker's crime scene? You know, or the Mad Hatter is the clue, and you're like, oh great, the Mad Hatter is the clue. I gotta go to Arkham Asylum and interview the Mad. Like, it just seemed like such an obvious idea. We couldn't believe it hadn't been done before, and in fact it had. But we did it more like Homicide. That was our original innovation, was to rip off our favorite TV show. I wrote much more procedural stuff on that than Greg did. Greg's stories had some procedure in them, but were much more character-based, whereas mine were much more the sort of chunk, Law and Order kind of, you know, you see the crime, you see how it follows through. Like, I just wanted to do, you know, stories like that because I love procedurals. But I think adding that superhero element to it, or the supervillains of Gotham City, you know, that's who they're really investigating the crimes of. I think that really gave it a unique twist that you could only get in the DC universe. Like, you could only have that book in Gotham City and have it be the book that it ended up being.
Hellboy. Some people see him as a detective. Others see him as a government agent. He's definitely not your average Cape Crusader. But Mike Mignola just sees him as a central character in one of the most popular supernatural stories in comics.
I never really view Hellboy as mixing the detective genre with the supernatural, because I've never been a crime fiction guy or a mystery guy, so I really always viewed it as a straight supernatural book. Hellboy does very little detecting. You know, he just kind of stumbles into stuff, and he almost never solves something by putting two and two together. Usually he has to just fight his way out of something. It's not even, you know, defeating the bad guy by beating him. Usually Hellboy just manages to survive things out of, you know, kind of dumb luck. The thing I didn't want to do in Hellboy was pick a particular religion and say, this is the religion of Hellboy. That's where, you know, writing vague comes in handy. I figure there's invisible threads that connect all this stuff up, but I don't want Hellboy to be a science fiction book. I don't want to go in there and say, and demystify it. I don't want to go in there and explain, this is this, and the fairies are really this, and Baba Yaga is the descendant of this alien race. I didn't want to do that stuff. I've seen that done with so many other mythologies, and the more you do that, the more you take the mystery out. And my feeling with doing a supernatural book, I always wanted that element in there that was unknowable. I have some vague sense of how all this stuff works, but I can never trot it all out and show it to you, because then, you know what the rules are for the universe, and it's, you know, then it's not supernatural anymore.
John Constantine is a magician who is anything but your typical idea of a hero. The basis for the character was to remove the standard cloak and wand trappings of a wizard and replace them with a hard-smoking, hard-drinking, trench coat-wearing, blue-collar magician. Comic books, like television, film, or literature, can tell any story the writer and artist choose. They can even take something as well-known as the story of King Arthur and put their own unique twist on it.
Mage strides a kind of interesting balance. It freely mixes a bunch of genres, and it has a mystical quality to it. It's also kind of a superhero tale, told through the eyes of an everyman, a modern everyman, a kind of mid-20s slacker who discovers that he has a purpose and a mystical reality far beyond what he had imagined for himself. In the first stage of the Mage trilogy, it very much echoes motifs from Arthurian legend. And this is something I'd been interested in for a long, long time, and had actually started a former version of this story that was much more traditional and ordinary in its approach. And it suddenly occurred to me that that for me to update a myth like that, I had to put it in the context of today. And I happened upon the idea that his weapon, Excalibur, instead of being a sword, who carries a sword around in modern day, would be a baseball bat. Similarly, the other characters in the Arthurian myth, I searched for some contemporary motif to address them in. Like Merlin in the old myths is always a kind of in the fringes of that society, the medieval society. And so I made Merlin a homeless bag person. I think for myth to have a resonance and a power, it has to speak to the time and the place and the people that it's addressing. You throw magic into the mix, of course, it seems like the rules are out the window, that anything and everything can happen. And yet, I find as an author, you just kind of instinctively fall into a flow of what works and what doesn't within that reality. you don't want magic to be able to solve everything. You know, I mean, I always remember in the reading of the original King Arthur myths, you know, Merlin was always portrayed as this very powerful wizard, but he never seemed to do anything. And the point was that the magic could get out of hand and could overtake the story that was being told. I find that you kind of, almost like you're making up a brand new sport. You know, you're just making up the rules as you go, but the rules have to be there. It has to work.
After the break, Jonah Hex and 100 Bullets. Two separate books because, as we all know, Jonah only needs one bullet to get the job done. A superhero story is about the ultimate force of good, the hero. A horror story is about the ultimate evil. Evil and horror come in many shapes and sizes.
I don't think there are any, the rules of what makes horror. But I'll tell you, if you put a monster in it, that helps.
If a horror story doesn't affect you in some creepy fashion and you feel creeped out by it, it's not successful.
We tried everything. We did walking corpses and vampires and werewolves and zombies and just plain gore.
There was a writer-editor named Archie Goodwin who had sort of created most of the Warren magazines, and he had sent out a couple-page thing on how to write comics for him. And part of it was make your secondary characters interesting. Make them, if you're going to kill off a character, just don't kill them off. Make them interesting before you kill them off. That particular statement sort of affected everything in the way Tomb of Dracula worked, where every incidental character who I knew was going to die had to be built up first, rather than, oh, Dracula sees somebody walking down the street, attacks. If he's going to do that, it's going to be from the point of view of the other character. You're going to find out their life story first. You're going to find out why it's horrifying that Dracula is killing them. If you do that, I think the readers find some meaning in the story, as opposed to, you know, just a slasher.
When I originally came up with 30 Days a Night, it was as a film pitch. And I actually spent while I was working at a bookstore in Burbank, I would, I'd work at nights and then I'd go out pitching during the day. The high concept is a small town in Alaska that goes dark for periods of time, and they're invaded by vampires. Vampires who don't have to stop, pause, breathe, sleep, anything for 30 days. And they have to stay alive. The reaction at the time was, oh, we have Buffy, we have Blade. And I was like, did you not hear my pitch? But evidently nobody's doing scary vampires. And that was a big thing with Ben and I. We were like, God, vampires have been so mellowed out. They're action heroes, and teenage girls are dating them, and, Count Chocula, and it's just like we've completely tamed these guys. So we were like, we gotta make vampires mean again. Not even the first issue came out, but the ad for the first issue came out, and the very same people who had, said no to me were calling, asking me why I hadn't pitched them this idea.
Created by Sergio Aragonés, Gru the Wanderer started out as a humorous homage to Conan the Barbarian. The front and back covers of issue number 6 more or less sums up an average day in the life of Gru. Although superheroes have remained a constant in comics, the Western seems to rise and fall in popularity. But it's a genre that never dies.
The attraction to the Old West is basically good and evil, good versus evil. It's classic storytelling. It's Shakespeare on every level. It's everything you ever want in a story can be done in a Western and has been done in a Western. We've had ghost story Westerns, we've had big action Westerns, we've had very heartfelt Westerns, and it's because people living on the edge, people exploring, living in a place they've never been.
I think one of the things that's important about Westerns and that makes it so attractive to people is that the protagonist is in control of his destiny, almost completely, which is something that's really, really lost in modern society.
A Western will always have an attraction to people because, again, it's basic. There's just a guy with a gun.
He's been around for over 30 years, and he hasn't gotten any nicer with age.
Jonah Hex, the character, was created in the 70s, and it's the ultimate bounty hunter. He's a really messed up, scarred, ugly dude that takes no crap from anyone. And it's a character I loved growing up, and when the opportunity came at DC to, it hasn't been touched in over 20 years, to kind of do a new series, Justin Gray and I, we kind of ran for it. They were like, well, convince us. Tell us why you think it would sell, why people would want to see it now. And I think we pitched it that we said we're going to do like Dirty Harry in the Old West, or like the Punisher in the Old West. And the joke was, that's exactly what the book's always been. But again, it's 30 years later, there's all new people doing the job, and they're like, oh, okay, that sounds cool, we'll try that. We're not really changing anything. We just updated the knowledge of the Old West a little bit. We don't have the Indians being the bad guys all the time. At its roots, he's still a bounty hunter going after the bad guy. He's nasty, he's mean, he can't stand kids, he drinks too much, he loves those whores, and you know, he's a fun character because you never know what's gonna happen with him, except for the fact that somebody's gonna die of lead poisoning by the end of the episode.
Although Jonah Hex started out in the Old West, there was an attempt to put him in a post-apocalyptic future titled Hex. The run was short-lived. The superhero world is one that is often made up of absolutes, good and evil, black and white. Noir, however, is a genre that deals mainly with shades of gray, creating more questions than answers. Find out more when we return. Wild West, pulp adventure, the front lines of World War II. There are a lot of genres besides the superhero, and these are some of the essentials. Here's Comics 101. Fantasy, fairy tales, and sci-fi are just three of the genres tackled and forged by CrossGen. The book is an anthology covering all of CrossGen's various titles. A veteran of Sergeant Rock, artist Joe Kubert teams with Brian Azzarello to create a hard-edged war story that seems to leap off the page. Taking place in Sarge's home of the World War II era, Hell in a Hard Place wastes no time in showing the reader the horror of war. Alan Moore and Kevin O'Neill's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen mixes not only genres but famous characters from literature, such as Mina Harker, the Invisible Man, and Alan Quatermain, uniting them to fight the forces of evil. The book and the movie share only one thing: the title. Noir is a world of trouble. There are no superheroes in stories like these to keep things on the straight and narrow. Noir is about people, and no matter how hard they try, they don't always do the right thing.
Noir comics owe a lot to noir movies. Obviously, the noir movie genre, the very high contrast, black and white, sort of, good man in a world of evil, detective in a moral quandary kind of situation. They owe a lot to it actually by way of the cartoonist Will Eisner, who did The Spirit back in the 40s and early 50s, who adapted that kind of filmic aesthetic to comics.
Noir is about mistakes. It's at the heart of noir, it's about mistakes. It's about little people making big mistakes.
Almost all noir stories are about a person making the wrong decision and knowing that they're making the wrong decision while they do it, but they can't stop themselves. And that's really kind of, that's what the genre is about.
Noir is it's a philosophical way of looking at things. It's not Venetian blinds and light streaming through them in an office. That's not what it is. Anybody can have that. Hell, I got that at home.
There's something about that world that's always kind of spoken to me. There's like this sort of American desperation, and who doesn't love a heist, and who doesn't, when they're standing too long in line at the bank, start scouting the place out and try to figure out how you could rob it on the right day.
Brian Azzarello's 100 Bullets is a noir story with a twist. It starts by asking one very simple question: if you could get away with murder, would you?
A man comes up and gives you an attaché with 100 rounds of ammunition, a gun, and a picture of somebody that had done you egregious wrong, and the ability to get away with getting revenge. That was the hook. The story itself has evolved into a multi-level American conspiracy story that goes back 400 years.
A book like 100 Bullets deals with more arch stereotypes, but I think Brian portrays the characters in a very realistic, human way within some of those arch stereotypes.
There are no heroes or villains in 100 Bullets. There's just people. Graves is motivated to restore order. He is a very, very rigid person, and he likes things orderly in everyone's life, which is why he offers the briefcases. It's a chance. Your life is out of control, and it's because of this event. Take control of your life. Use this information. That's what Graves offers. Megan's got something that makes men in a similar position just as sexually attractive, and that's money and power. Money and power equals sex. That's the secret formula in everyone. Lono's a character that I created. He is a complete sociopath. And he's probably the most popular character in the book. There's something cathartic about those kind of characters. And I suppose Lono is just a more either distilled or exploded version of the basic 100 Bullets question anyway. If you could get away with murder, would you do it?
Ed Brubaker has written heroes like Captain America and Daredevil. He's also one of the writers of Gotham Central. And if you know how to write a believable cop, very often that means you know how to write a very believable criminal.
Coward is sort of the flip side of every heist story that I'd seen in a while. I wanted to take a very careful person who had seen, you know, what violence can do to destroy people's lives, and so he'd bottled up, you know, every violent urge inside himself, and to the point where people actually considered him a coward. But in reality, the only thing he was afraid of was sort of, you know, uncorking that bottle. And you know, so he gets pulled into a heist because he's an amazing heist planner, and everything goes wrong. Basically, the heist isn't what they told him it was going to be. He, you know, ends up on the run with a wounded accomplice, and then because of everything that they've gone through, you know, he ends up having to uncork that bottle finally. It's really a character study, and that's one of the things I love about crime stories and I love about noir is that ultimately, regardless of the, you know, who's screwing who and who's killing who and who's stealing what, ultimately they're really just about people.
I hear you. We all love Clark Kent, Peter Parker, their super-powered alter egos, but comic books offer all kinds of fiction that range in story and subject as wide as any medium. One thing's for sure, it's definitely not just a superhero world anymore. If I told you movies are made about the Old West, conspiracy theories, hard-boiled criminals, or even wizards, you wouldn't be surprised. Film is just a medium to tell stories. Comic books are exactly the same, but many people assume it's all one genre, the superhero.
Superhero is one of the few, maybe one of the only, that's the only genre that really sort of does originate in comics and comic books especially. They existed before Superman, but Superman clearly is the paradigm, it's the beginning of the whole genre. And of course they're ideal for that because anything is possible, spectacle and the fantasy is completely unlimited in the comics form. And I think there's a particular
The funny thing is, I hate to think of myself as a superhero specialist. I wrote a lot of them because they're what sold the best.
I love superheroes, but we have so narrowed it that the stuff that isn't superheroes is really marginalized.
I think comic book stores are a wonderful thing, except to the extent that they encourage everything to look like X-Men.
Gets into police work. You follow the cop as they follow the criminal. Now you tell that story in Gotham City and you're dealing with a whole new kind of cop story.
Gotham Central sprung out of me and Greg Rucka being asked to write a book together. And the book that they asked us to write together, we both said we'd do just to work with each other. But then we were working on a thing called Officer Down, where Jim Gordon, Commissioner Gordon, got shot. And it was a police procedural in Gotham City. The stars of it were really the cops investigating it, and the Batman characters became sort of peripheral characters around that. While we were working on that, Greg and I were talking about this other project, and I just asked him, do you really want to do this, or are you just doing this so we can work together? And he admitted he was doing it for the same reason I was, and I said, well, let's do our cop book. We're having more fun writing these cops. Let's propose the cop book, because somehow we had talked about it.
We know that except under certain very rare, very narrow circumstances, most of which I wouldn't want to pursue, there's really no market for a Western. I'd love to do an old-fashioned romance comic, you know, what they call a girl's book, but of course, girls don't buy comics, you'll be told by the guy behind the counter in the comic shop who's going to be ordering the comics, so you know he's not going to order it.
There are stores where X-Men is their #1 seller, or something like X-Men is their #1 seller, and they don't really have the shelf space or the inclination to market much else. So they become shrines to that. They paint the outsides of their stores with things with drawings that essentially say, all we've got in here are superheroes, people. And then only people who buy superheroes go in, and the stores go, well, that's all the public wants. And they miss the opportunity that they could sell something else in there.
The police procedural is a type of crime fiction that really
American fascination with them, which the rest of the world has in different ways. I mean, there are other fantasy heroes in manga, has some samurai warriors, for example, and in France and much of Europe, bizarrely, the Western actually is still extraordinarily popular. That's a whole genre that's vanished from American comics.
Superheroes basically hijacked the comics medium in the American comics world. Because they were so appealing and so successful, when they were launched, they sort of just expanded and expanded until by the 50s or 60s, they were what everyone saw as being what happened in comic books.
The funny thing is, I hate to think of myself as a superhero specialist. I wrote a lot of them because they're what sold the best.
I've looked at stuff over the years and said, well, you know, I would love to do a Western, for example, but we really